Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, I attended a workshop last Tuesday at UC Davis. It was an American Water Works Association training class in rate design. There are lots of other water companies that are not commission regulated. Many of them owned by municipalities or districts, quasi-governmental. Many of them by almost local governmental agencies, very much like our regulated water companies, very small. In fact, they said, and I assume it's true, 80% of the water delivered in the whole country is delivered by water entities with less than 100 customers. What do all of these water companies have in common? They have to charge rates. Well, as those of you in the business know, the rates have to cover the costs. But once they do that, they can be anything you want. And that's what I learned, or had reinforced to me, at last Tuesday's meeting. The points that I'd like to touch on, though, are not the rate points, the rate design points specifically, but how did they present their issues. The first presenter was talking about capital finance. Now, as I say, we're talking tiny, quote, companies here, many of whom don't really know with great clarity what their financial situation is, especially government agencies which can get grants and more easily get loans than our regulated, independently owned water companies can. So the person that did this was from UC Davis. He was with their finance center, and he was filling us in on all of the problems that these small companies have. Gave us some good financial background, and the way he did it was he gave us examples. So he didn't go through what's a general ledger and all of this stuff. He talked about a small water company and the problems that small water company has. This is something to keep in mind. When you give a speech, it's much better if it's immediate. Now, for example, when Claudette gave her speech, started out kind of slow until we got into her personal relationships with the issues. One thing that I remember many years ago when they give speeches is they talk about Nordstrom. Now, Nordstrom was new at the time, and they were touting their customer service. And there was a lot of stories in those speeches about Nordstrom's customer service because they were talking to business people and they were trying to make the point. All of it clearly lies. You just could not believe that a company was that good, and the reason you could not believe it was because it wasn't. But professional speakers would get up and tell these lies to people who were paying them to present these speeches because they were delivering a message, and it was the most effective way to deliver that message. So when you put your talk together, do like Jeff did and put it in a specific example or a personal example, and it doesn't have to be true. You can make something up as long as it says to your audience what you want your audience to hear. The second part of the presentation was a panel discussion. Now, panel discussions are usually boring because the panelists have no way of coordinating their presentations before. So they did a smart thing here, which was they gave each panelist 10 minutes to make their presentation, and they gave the rest of us an hour to ask them questions. This is another thing to keep in mind if you're ever putting together a business meeting, especially if it's within your organization. Most of the people that are going to be in the audience know 90% of this stuff already. All your panelists need to do is introduce themselves and present their expertise, because the audience is going to get the majority of their value from the presentation by asking questions. And that's what happened to us. We filled that whole hour. In fact, we had a bunch of questions left over at the end of that time. It did a good thing, which I think a lot of people would naturally assume is a good idea, but not happens that often. And that was they had us write our questions out first. I mean, Kay knows in many instances we've been to a event that calls for questions. And what do you get? People get up and pontificate. They talk about whatever they want to talk about. They don't ask any questions of the panelists. And that's the value to the rest of us, is to hear what the panelists say. We don't care what our other attendees say. We don't know that they're experts at anything. But the panelists, in being able to get some insight from them, was the real value at the speech. The last thing was the presentation by a UC Davis professor and a private individual who was on the water rate design committee for UC Davis. And they have a new idea for allocating the fixed costs, the non-variable, my brain, the fixed costs of providing service. And they're doing this in a way that would have been impossible 20 years ago. But because we have computers and because we can crunch numbers quickly, they're actually tying the fixed costs allocations to the amount of water used. And it's a fascinating approach because it doesn't matter for you regulators which area you're in. The allocation of fixed costs, because all of our utilities, the majority of costs are fixed, is an important issue for rate makers. So I got a lot out of this day. It was a good investment of my time, not because I learned a lot of new things other than this one that I mentioned, but it refreshed my ideas and my knowledge about these issues. But the main thing I got out of it was they took their time, they did great planning, and they presented a great presentation for that day. Mr. Toastmaster.